All right. Well, I think we can get started. Susan, do you want to take down the intro slide for the moment? All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to a peek under the hood of the En-ROADS climate model with the New Hampshire Network for Environment, Energy, and Climate. I am Reinmar Zeidler, member of the New Hampshire Network Steering Committee, and we are extremely pleased to have with us today Josh Loughman, Director of Modeling and Technology at Climate Interactive, to introduce us to the En-ROADS Global Climate Solutions Simulator and to tell us about some of the recent updates to the model. So before we start out, though, let me remind us that this event takes place in Ndakina, the ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples, past and present. We acknowledge and honor with gratitude this land, the waterways, and the people who have stewarded Ndakina throughout the generations. By the way, I was recently told by an Abenaki speaker that this is how Abenaki and Wabanaki are pronounced. I hope it's correct. That's what I was told. This event is being recorded. Everyone who registered will receive a link to the recording when it's ready. And as always, please remember, everyone, to stay on mute. And please drop your questions in the chat. We want this to be interactive. And we're very much up for questions, and Josh's too. Now, before I introduce Josh, I just wanted to say a couple of words about models in general. British statistician George Box said, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And reality is made up of a tremendous number of variables. A modeler has to decide which variables are important to include and which can be left out. Very challenging. The En-ROADS model is specifically intended to be useful in a very practical sense. So the assumptions that underlie the user interface and the functionality are absolutely critical. We'll have a look at some of these assumptions as we go along, and we'll hear from Josh about how the team decides what to include and what to leave out. And then also the network is also trying to make sure that each of our events includes some specific actions that people can take in response to what we hear. So we'll leave some time at the end for my colleague John Gage to give guidance on some very specific actions that folks can take. And now I would like to introduce Josh Loughman, our guest speaker for tonight. Josh leads the Climate Interactive's modeling and software development teams. He has an extremely diverse background in systems engineering, project management, modeling, and strategic foresight. He's an expert on the future of energy at the World Economic Forum and an affiliate Global Futures Scholar at the Global Futures Laboratory at Arizona State University. And that's where he received his master's in systems engineering and also BSc in aerospace engineering. And he also received a graduate certificate in systems dynamics from Worcester Polytech. And Josh also volunteers with a group called a service organization, I guess, called Engineers Without Borders, and other international humanitarian engineering projects. And he's volunteered in Mexico, in the Dominican Republic, Czech Republic, Vietnam, Nepal, Honduras, Navajo Nation. So he's been all over the place. And we welcome him tonight, and we are very much looking forward to hearing about En-ROADS from Josh Loughman. Josh.
Thanks, Reinmar. I actually need to update that. I just got back from Nicaragua, where we're doing our newest Engineers Without Borders project. But thank you very much for that very warm introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be here. It's really exciting to get to talk about the model that I spend so much time working on and that my team is engaged with all the time. And we're really proud of some of the newest work that we've done. So I'm excited to showcase all of that. So I'm Josh Sloan. I run our tech team at Climate Interactive. We also work really closely with MIT's Sloan School of Management. And we actually, our technical advisor, John Sturman at MIT, just gave this workshop with En-ROADS to 41 members of Congress last week. And so thinking about what's the use case for a model like this, it's our primary audience, or one of our two primary audiences, is that top level decision makers that are going to be able to engage with a model like this in a workshop and walk away with some insights, walk away with some of their own mental models tested. En-ROADS is, of course, our signature project, our signature offering right now. It's a free-to-use, openly available on the internet solution simulator. It's translated into 20 languages, while the newest work hasn't quite been translated into all 20 languages yet, but we're hoping that by next month that all the translations will be done. We have a free, openly available training program called Mastering En-ROADS through our website. We have over 800 people that have gone through that program and do workshops like this all over the world, and we've engaged over 1 million users now. So we're really excited by the reach and the feedback that we get from using the model in this way. And so with that, I'll talk a little bit about what I want to show you all today. So I'm really excited about the new work that we've done and the work that we've done maybe over the last year or so. But principally the methane work that we just released last week. But I know some of you have familiarity with En-ROADS and some of you may not. And so I'm going to do, as a way of acquainting or reacquainting you with it, a very quick version of our Let's Solve Climate Change workshop. And so when we get to this point, I will ask all of you to brainstorm with me what solutions you want to test, and we'll try to get to the Paris Agreement goal of below 2 degrees, well below 2 degrees, targeting 1.5 degrees below pre-industrial temperature rise. And with that, I'm going to share my screen so that as I'm talking about En-ROADS, it's a little bit easier to contextualize. And so En-ROADS stands for Energy Rapid Overview and Decision Support. And it is effectively a real-time integrated assessment model. So very much the same kind of tools that the IPCC and the other large climate organizations that are modeling the integrated assessments. So this is energy production, the energy end-use sectors like electrification of transportation and buildings and industry, but also the carbon cycle, also land use and forest policy, and a variety of assumptions that users can test along the way. You'll see the energy supply policies here on this left side, more of the end use policies like transportation, buildings, and industry here in the center, and other policies like carbon dioxide removal. Again, if you're familiar with En-ROADS, you'll notice that this part of our interface has gone through this recent change. So where this used to say afforestation, we now have nature-based carbon dioxide removal, which includes policies like afforestation, but also other policies like biochar, which used to be in the technological carbon removal sector. And we also have disaggregated the methane sector. So where before we had one slider for methane policy, methane and other gases all bundled into one policy sector, we now have two, which is agriculture emissions, and waste and leakage, which is really the waste sector and the energy sector combined there. So En-ROADS, we continually update this. We have a release for En-ROADS about once a month. A lot of that work is keeping up with the latest science and the latest economics understanding. So as new science, as new economics research comes out, we're continually updating our model, the under the hood part of this work that hopefully we'll get to talk about a little bit. I mentioned our primary audiences, top decision makers, and public audiences like students, activists, and business leaders. One of the main design philosophies of our interface has been this notion that if we give the model to a smart 8th grader or the average New York Times reader, they should be able to, quote unquote, solve for climate change in under 5 minutes with minimal instructions. So they should be able to play around, understand what they're doing. But this high-level interface, you'll notice there are no numbers for energy supply, no numbers for electrification, no numbers for carbon dioxide removal. It's all about directionality at this level. It's, do I want more renewables or do I want less renewables? Do I want to subsidize them or do I want to tax them? Do I want to increase the subsidies for transportation electrification, or do I want to increase the energy efficiency of transportation? So these are the kinds of policy options that we give users. A lot of integrated assessment models are cost optimized. So they are finding the least cost option using a number of assumptions. And Reinmar talked about how all models are wrong and some are useful. Our philosophy with our model is a little different. We want to be policy centric, not cost optimized, right? So these are, you're a policymaker, you're a voting member of the public. What is it that you think is a good policy? And let's explore that. Let's explore that mental model using this tool. And so with that, I'd like to change gears just a little bit and get your ideas as you're looking at these 19 policy sliders. What are the things that jump out to you as a way of getting from 3.3 degrees in 2100, 3.3 degrees above pre-industrial average surface temperature, down well below 2 degrees, approaching 1.5 degrees. So if you can put those ideas in the chat, and we'll collect maybe 3 or 4 of them, and then we'll start to test them and see where we think those policies could lead us. Are those really highly effective policies, or maybe they're policies that have really great co-benefits, but the climate outcomes might be a little less significant. I see a couple now coming in the chat. That's good. Let's see if someone could summarize maybe 2 or 3 of them that we should test.
Well, we've got several about carbon pricing, carbon tax. Let's start with some of these other. How about the methane? There's methane leakage. A couple people are talking about methane.
Great.
Rate of growth of distributed energy resources. Okay, we can look at that one afterwards.
So I think renewable energy, distributed renewable energy is kind of the idea there. I think this is a great one to start with because this really speaks to one of the other things that we changed earlier this year. So if we, this is directionality. We can have more renewables, less renewables. But if we click here on the 3 dots, of course, we can go in and we can set a more precise subsidy for renewable energy. We can establish time controls for those policies. We can look at the economics of those sectors. And one of the things that we'll notice is this is all behavior over time graph, right? That we're here in 2024, and these graphs go out to 2100. This first plot, this first graph of global sources of primary energy has coal, oil, gas, and this widening wedge of renewable energy. So we're already looking at a future, even in our baseline scenario, where there's going to be a significant increase in renewable energy compared to today. And so as we subsidize this, of course, we're going to expect this wedge to increase, which will decrease the amount of fossil fuel sources of energy, which should decrease the amount of greenhouse gas net emissions. Okay, so let's go ahead and, in the spirit of a rapid version of this workshop, let's go ahead and just push that subsidy all the way. This is 5 cents per kilowatt hour subsidy. And now one of the things that we'll notice is in the greenhouse gas net emissions, they do start to decline. And in around 2040, early 2040s, it reaches this point where there's a bit of a rebound. and in a full workshop, we would go into like a full analytical mode here where we would ask the audience, what do you think is going on here? And there'd be a number of points of feedback. But as you know, in the spirit of kind of moving quickly through this introduction, I will give you like a really strong hint, maybe, is as we look at the energy mix of electricity. So this is the electric final energy consumption by source. You can see that primary energy had a lot of renewable energy. Final energy has even more. But you can also see in this 2040s that there is this point where renewable energy is getting harder and harder to accommodate, right? There's more variability in renewable energy. There's solar when the sun shines, there's wind when the wind blows. There are different ways. There's 3 ways we could accommodate that. One of those ways is through demand response. One of those ways is through long distance transmission, which of course the US is currently working on policies at FERC around that kind of accommodation. The third way you can accommodate it is with energy storage. And so if we go down here, we have 2 different sources of energy storage. We have hydrogen, and then we have this category called other storage. And you'll see that here we have this one. This is the amount of energy storage that's needed to accommodate the variable renewable energy that we have. And if we look at why that constraint on renewables might be happening, it's because the storage costs are rising. Wind and solar are effectively free with that subsidy, but storage costs add to that as that percentage of the grid goes up to 70–80% of variable renewable energy. But if we see a hydrogen breakthrough, we'll see more renewable energy potential. You'll see the cost of storage will decline. And you'll see here on this right graph, the renewables primary energy demand will go up. And that's because it is becoming more attractive compared to fossil fuels because of the accommodation with hydrogen. We can also accommodate it with other storage. And there's more to come on additional hydrogen features in the future. So let's say maybe a 50% storage breakthrough on both hydrogen and a 25% breakthrough on hydrogen, 50% on other storage with this renewables. So now here we are, 3.2 degrees. Okay.
Josh, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Can you name some of the other storage technologies that are aggregated under that one variable?
So we have a lot of storage currently in the model. That's very traditional battery storage. This other storage category is really some of the more exotic storage concepts. And you can see, they're pumped hydro, that's not so exotic, but like gravity storage, which is being experimented with, but has certain limitations like pumped hydro. And then this yet to be developed storage technology. It's really kind of an imaginary technology at the moment. But there's a lot of research and development out there in these kinds of technologies. But it's really to juxtapose that with hydrogen.
Mm-hmm. So the idea is to give the model flexibility to accommodate potential new innovations.
Absolutely. Yep. Okay, what's maybe the next? I heard carbon price. Of course, any veteran user of En-ROADS knows that carbon price is probably it is the largest lever you can pull. So let's take a look at, we'll go back here to primary energy totals, and let's look at let's take a look at this graph here, which is our final energy consumption by end use. And if we pull the carbon price, actually, let's look at emissions. So as we pull the carbon price slider out, and again, this slider will go up to We currently have it set at $5, which is our assessment of the global average. This is a good point. This is a good time to point out that carbon price in this model is a globally aggregated policy. So it's the average of the world policies, but it goes up to $250 per ton CO2. John, did you have a question?
I was just going to note that you still have the previous policy turned on. I don't know if that's on purpose or not. Then I
Yeah,
decided to.
we're going to add them all up. Yeah, we're
Yeah.
going to keep going with them. So as we add carbon price, we should see coal, oil, gas continue to decline, and CO2 net emissions continue to decline as well. And so if we go to, let's say, $150 a ton, that gets us down to about 2.5 degrees. All right, so what's a third policy that we could experiment with to try and get below 2 degrees, maybe approaching 1.5?
Can I ask you one quick thing about carbon price before we go on to the other one?
Yep.
The $5, that's actually higher than I would have expected. Um, and I wonder how that's calculated because it's not by country, is it? But it's not by is it by population or how do you calculate that?
We I'll have you'll have to not quote me on it exactly, but I believe it is weighted by energy emissions. It's weighted by national emissions. So the emissions from a country with a carbon price, that's the weighting.
Okay, so that explains why there is even one because I think if one did it by like, head of population, one would probably have like zero almost, or very close
Right.
to
It would be very low. Right. So I think methane waste and leakage was one of the other categories. I mentioned before that agricultural emissions and waste and leakage have been broken up from the older version of En-ROADS. And so let's take a look at greenhouse gas emissions, and we can look at this graph here, which is the methane emissions by source. So waste, agriculture, and of course energy production has already been reduced by both the carbon price and the subsidy for renewable energy. So that's already brought down a little bit. But another thing we can do, and this is really the brilliance of our modelers for methane, is not only did we break it up by sector, but we broke it up by phases of the life cycle. So methane comes from methane emitting activities, and then there are things you can do to make those activities less intense. So you can reduce let's use agriculture as an example, because I think this is the best example. This is the total agricultural production of the world that we model. This is the scale of how much agriculture there is. That's a methane emitting activity. And if we go in and say, I want to reduce the methane and nitrous oxide from livestock using some percentage of the best practices that are out there, that's not going to reduce agriculture. That's going to make agriculture more efficient. So we can take a look at that. Let's take a look at that graph here. So we'll look at total agriculture production, and then we'll look at the methane intensity of agriculture. And so one way to reduce the total agriculture production would be maybe population change. But we could also, under agricultural emissions, we could also reduce the amount of food from animals. So as we reduce the amount of food from animals, the total agricultural production goes down. Now, the intensity of agriculture goes down a little bit as well, because there's some efficiency gains by not having to feed animals, that we could use that food for something else. There's also food waste, which will reduce the total agricultural production, but not so much the intensity of those activities. But if we use the best practices around methane and nitrous oxide for livestock and crops, we can see reductions in the intensity of that. And it's really the agricultural production multiplied by the intensity that gives us our total emissions. So we can now look here. If we bring these back, we can see how our emissions changed as a result. And there are time controls for these as well. Best practices take a long time to be adopted, certainly worldwide. So we assume a 30-year adoption period. Now we could cut that in half, and we could say what would happen if the world were to adopt these practices much more rapidly and much more completely. So we are now at 2.3 degrees C. Are there any other ideas for, oh, I guess we talked about waste and leakage as well. So we could, looking under here, we could say, what are the best practices around methane leakage from energy systems? What gains would it give us to improve the leaks of all the natural gas systems? And let's see, this one's going to be primary. So this is on the left-hand side, the behavior over time graph of methane emissions by energy, by the 4 different primary sources of methane emissions and energy: coal, oil, gas, and bioenergy. And then there's also this methane intensity of primary energy. Now, again, there's this little bump and then a decline around 2040. And this is where we would go into a more analytical mode, and we might try to understand what that means. And I'll maybe jump to the chase, which is, as we cut with carbon price a lot of energy emissions, the denominator of those of that fraction changes, and so there's a bit of catching up that intensity has to this intensity calculation has. Now we can look at what will the effect of plugging those leaks be. And this is waste, so we can go and we can look at what is the methane intensity of waste, and we can reduce that as well. So as we do both of these, we're now, a little under 2.3 degrees, about 0.3 degrees away from our goal of being at least at or below 2. What's maybe one more that we can look at?
Josh, these might be policy issues that are very significant to us in New Hampshire. The rate of growth of distributed energy resources, raising the amount of how many megawatts we're allowed on net metering, transmission. So those are policy decisions that are being made at our State House every year, or not.
Yeah, and in En-ROADS, it's a global model, and so there's a lot of aggregation that takes place. We would model those things primarily as a subsidy for renewable energy. Or if we go to the assumptions here, we could go down to electricity storage and demand response. So transmission policies and policies around net metering could be modeled as a potential for demand response, using the energy when the energy is being produced by those variable renewable sources rather than needing storage. And so, we can adjust this. It turns out to not have a very large effect when you're averaging globally. Of course, local policies can be quite significant. Thanks for the question. Are there others?
There's one other one that's relevant to our state, which is the efficiency of the built environment. We have a lot of old buildings that are not efficient, and that's making a big difference, to both to people and also to the environment. How do you what if you raise the efficiency? What happens then?
Yes, that's a great question. So if we look here at, there's 2 energy efficiency sliders that we can toggle. One is for transportation and one is for buildings and industry. And one way to, let's see if I look at finance, one way to think about that is with the financial flows, particularly fuel costs. So if I make transport more efficient, or if I make buildings and industry more efficient, you'll see depression on some of the fossil fuel prices as electricity becomes more favorable. And of course, there's a symbiotic effect with energy efficiency and electrification. So even if we just do a little bit of efficiency and a little bit of electrification, we're now at 2.1 degrees. And with transportation, we get another 0.1 degrees. And maybe as a way of getting us across the threshold, we can look at deforestation policy. So when we have two different kinds of deforestation policies. There's deforestation, the cutting down and permanent removal of existing forests, and that's primarily due to the increasing demand on cropland. And so there's a crop yield feedback. We can talk more about that if there are questions. That the worse we think climate change will affect our ability to grow crops, the more land we'll need to feed ourselves. And in our model, we assume everyone eats, right? That nearly all nutritional requirements are met, which of course is one of those simplifying assumptions. But if you assume that, then that cropland has to come from somewhere, and some of it can come from other land, which is another category of land that we model, but most of it comes from forested land, and that will permanently change the state of that forest land to deforestation. Now, the other category is mature forest degradation. And so if we go to this graph, we can see the age, the cohorts of forests. So we have this green line is the old growth forests of the world. And the black line are the very young forests. Could be reforested land, could be afforested land, could just be new regrowth from forest fires. And then there's the blue line, which is this middle-aged cohort, 50 to 100 years. And each of these age cohorts of forests have a different effect on the amount of carbon that they sequester from the atmosphere, the amount that they bury in biomass under the soil, and the amount that could be released if they are chopped down, burned, turned into wood products, etc. And so our top slider, this main slider here for deforestation, and maybe I can bring up a more interesting graph here, is both a deforestation reduction and a reduction in the use of mature forests for bioenergy and wood products. So if we slide this, we'll see these will all reduce, and you can see the age cohorts beginning to separate. So we've protected the older forests, and so they continue to grow, but we still need food. We still need wood products, and we still need wood for bioenergy in this scenario. So where do those come from? Well, those are going to come from these younger and middle-aged cohorts. Now we can split this up into reductions in just deforestation or just mature forest degradation. And then there are many assumptions about tree regrowth, and we did an entire analysis on afforestation that was featured in the Washington Post, and I can share that link to you if people haven't seen it. So with that, aggressive deforestation and forest degradation policies, we got below 2 degrees And then there are maybe other things that we can start to experiment with and look at trade-offs for to get closer to 1.5 degrees. But I think I'll leave it there. And then now let's talk a little bit about some of the areas that I didn't get to dive into with that. Unless there's maybe we'll just pause for questions there, and then I'll dive into some of the other areas that we've been modeling.
Oh, well, Josh, there's one other one, which is if we could remove whatever obstacles there are to population stabilization, have a less populous world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one of the things that we don't have in this model is feedback on population. So we have a population slider, but this slider ranges from the low to the high range of the United Nations projections. And so we do have graphs, we do have impacts on things like the additional deaths from extreme heat that different regions could experience, given this baseline scenario or reduction scenario. But we're not feeding that value back on to population in the same way that we do crop yield and food growth and economic growth from the economic damage function. There have been many questions that have been raised about how to ethically model population in an integrated assessment model. And it's something that we keep in mind regularly and consider regularly. But at this point, we haven't engaged in that. One of the areas that we are looking at right now, excuse me, one of the areas that we are looking at right now is a range of human health impacts. And it's still early on, so we're still in the prototyping phase of that work. But a lot of human health impacts could be very significant for population growth. The increase in the range of vector-borne diseases is an enormous threat to human, life, to the morbidity and mortality statistics. And so that is something that we are keeping in mind.
So Josh, so the UN framework basically presents a range of possible scenarios based on no policy, no specific policy, or the policies that now exist, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So no change essentially, but we don't know exactly how that's going to play out in the future.
Yeah, and I think a related question to that, which we get very often, is how do we model a degrowth scenario economically, or a post-growth scenario? And we have both a long and a near-term economic growth value under the advanced settings here. But even here, our economic growth, even if you were to very quickly transition to a low growth scenario, they're still not zero or degrowth. And part of this is a modeling choice to kind of capture some of the mainstream economic conversation, but this is one of those things that we're continually trying to keep up to date with, which is the latest science and the latest economic understanding. So again, an area for us to always be watchful for.
One last little question. I don't know how detailed this might seem, but I'm always curious how you deal with interactions between the variables. I mean, it seems to me that in some ways, some of these variables depend on others, and sometimes you don't know which comes first. It's sort of a chicken and the egg situation. How do you deal with that? Because right now we're looking at them as independent things, right?
Mm-hmm.
They might not be independent.
In terms of the policies themselves or the underlying variables?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, in terms of the policies, I mean, sometimes it seems as though it seems impossible to actually get to a policy change in one area until you've already gotten to a policy change in another area.
Sure. Yeah, so we've tried in a couple of different ways to capture that with the main sliders. So a good example of this and maybe I can, this is one of the new features that we developed last year, which is transportation electrification. And so this is electric share of sales. It's buildings and industry, electric share, transportation sales. So one thing that, as we were modeling the transport electrification sector, that we assessed was, people don't talk about, when policymakers talk about transportation policy for electric vehicles, they usually don't just talk about a subsidy or charging infrastructure. They usually talk about both. And so our main slider for road and rail transport electrification is both a subsidy and the necessary infrastructure, the charging infrastructure, charging stations that those vehicles need to kind of ameliorate any range anxiety that they might have, in one slider. And you have to go into the detailed settings to then say, okay, what would a subsidy do, but not any charging infrastructure? Or what would charging infrastructure alone be able to do? And so you're able to kind of interrogate those different policy options. Or we even have an ICE ban, right? What would happen if you just banned internal combustion engines? And then of course time controls. But for the main slider, this is the subsidy plus whatever charging infrastructure would be necessary to accommodate that. And so that's one way where we took two different policies and said, nobody really talks about these separately. They talk about them together. Let's make sure that that's grouped. You have the option to break them up, but in this case, they're grouped. We do the same thing with deforestation and forest degradation. And then others are maybe more, economically simplified. So the question that Susan raised about distributed energy sources and accommodating variable renewables, we sort of capture that in a subsidy, that you could boil it down to, oh, that's some kind of incentive or disincentive. We'll call that a subsidy or a tax. Same thing with coal. When you think about like highly taxed coal, it could also be the removal of coal subsidies. They sort of subtract in the same way. Now, in terms of how do all of these things get connected in the model? So the model itself is a parameterized system dynamics model, which means that there are a number of variables and equations that are simultaneously solved for each time step. So every 45 days from 1990 to 2100, all of the equations of this model are recalculated. And if there are variables that interact, so energy efficiency of transportation and electrification of transportation will feed back to the market price of oil. And so every time step, every 45 days, the price of oil is being recalculated given those changes in policies and their dynamics.
So some of that interaction is actually built in.
Yeah, absolutely. And in many ways, I think perhaps one of the classic examples of this is if you were to say tax natural gas, and then we were to go to the let's see, coal primary energy demand, and you might say, well, I taxed natural gas. Why did coal demand go up? And that's what we call squeezing the balloon, where you did a policy that had an effect, but then that effect is feeding back to the demand and the attractiveness of other things in the model, and it has to be accommodated somewhere. In this case, it's being accommodated partially by coal, but if we go to, bioenergy is also growing, and oil a little bit, but also renewables is making up some of that accommodation as well.
Mm-hmm.
Rob, you have a question?
Yes, I do. Just wanted to get off mute there, so I'm not looking ridiculous. So thank you so much for all this information. This has been awesome. I wasn't able to make a couple of the earlier En-ROADS presentations that John and now Reinmar have organized, and this is mind-blowing, to be honest. It's awesome. This is more of a procedural question, just sheer curiosity. How well received was this talk by the members of Congress that you gave it to?
So we've engaged with members of Congress a couple of times. I'll say that the audience we had this time was a little more receptive to climate policies in general. However, even both sides of the political aisle here, and ministers and parliamentarians in other countries as well, appreciate the transparency that we provide. So a lot of the integrated assessment models and other climate models are a little more opaque and black box than this. So the fact that we have all of our assumptions here, and if you think the potential abatement for the potential reduction in methane leaks is actually only 40% or up to 80%. You can adjust that as an assumption. If you think that different policies are going to be able to be enacted faster or slower, those are things that you can experiment with. And one of the questions we get that's related to this is, why don't you have error bars on your graphs? And part of what we've tried to engage users to do is to experiment with what they think are the uncertain variables. And by experimenting with that, if you say, what is your policy timing, right? I can experiment with that. I create my own error bars. And you can only do that with a real-time simulator. If you were using a regular integrated assessment model, you hit the button on Friday, you come back Monday and hope it didn't crash to get one scenario, right? We just looked at 1,000 scenarios in 40 minutes. And so that's your error bar right there. And so the exposure of those assumptions and the ability for a user to engage with them directly and get that real-time response is a huge benefit to the reception of all types of politicians, but really all types of users in general.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I mean, I didn't realize the 45-day time point of refresh either until this talk, and that's really powerful too. I imagine that's super compelling for folks that might think, or might be more accustomed to seeing talks from academics and wondering if it's already stale, right? And
Right.
that's amazing. Anyway, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Rob.
Josh, you were actually telling me before we started about some research at UMass Lowell it was really interesting in regards to people's acceptance of what or response, at least, to what you were telling
Yeah,
them.
one of our great collaborators, Juliet Rooney Varga at UMass Lowell, and some of her graduate students and some of our other collaborators have been doing some research on sentiment analysis around Twitter tweets. So they have a before and after data set of the politicians, their staffers, their official offices, and everything else, where they look at how often are they talking about climate change, how often are they talking about specific policies like carbon price, and so on. And they've actually shown some pretty statistically significant changes in the discursive behavior of these politicians on really both sides of the aisle, and in different caucuses. So it's quite a compelling story that our work has been getting out there and getting to people, making a difference. We have some anecdotal feedback from Congress people, senators, that they're using this model, or just engaging in these kinds of conversations. Because again, En-ROADS isn't an answer machine. It's about starting a conversation. It's a boundary object for having dialogue. And that dialogue is leading people to ask good questions and check their mental models. And that's leading them to want to know more and getting engaged in that kind of policy. So yeah, thanks for the reminder on that, Reinmar.
Mm-hmm.
Josh, I have a question about the different people that are on this call's perspective. We had some questions from a state legislator about, what would improve net metering policy at the state level too, and that kind of thing. Can you just maybe respond, how you see state policy affecting federal policy? And then from a federal policy perspective, how can that affect global policy?
Yeah.
And then the other way around, how does federal policy affect the state? Just, to wrap it up around the other direction too.
Yeah, so I'll tell a short story about how this methane work that we did, kind of the behind the scenes of how that works. So we were working with some experts in energy, agriculture, and waste, those specific sectors, and they wanted to know some really, really detailed things. Like, maybe I'll give you an example for like agricultural emissions. One of the policies that they were really excited about was, in developing countries, the best practice for livestock is cow health, right? Most cows are dairy cows, and when we talk about agricultural products from animals, it's mostly dairy. And the question was, how can we get an individual smallholder farmer in a developing country to use best practices to make their cows healthier so that their herd size can be shrunk? And there's some mathematical, there was a lot of modeling involved just to get to that point, really from the ground up from a policy perspective there. And the alternative is, if you're in a developed country, cow health is already pretty maximized, and it's now food additives and medicines and other kinds of technological treatments that reduce the methane of individual cows rather than trying to reduce the herd. Well, En-ROADS is a globally aggregated policy simulator, and as a result, we can't disaggregate to all 20 of those different policies that these experts would have wanted us to. So we settled on, we'll give you one for livestock and one for crops. And part of that is, that's the level of disaggregation that is still relevant at a global scale. And so, is net metering relevant at a global scale? One of the questions we were talking to this policy advisor from Maine, and he said, well, what would happen if we decarbonized Maine? Like, well, the global average temperature would change from 3.3 to 3.3, right? It would not be measurable in this model. And so everything that we put into this, we want it to be able to challenge or speak to some kind of mental model. And so if it doesn't change the temperature, it's probably too disaggregated for it to be meaningful in this context. Now, that said, this is not an answer machine, right? It's the starter of a conversation. So how did we work with those methane folks? We said, you've got to think globally, right? What are the things that are going to really change the global average temperature? And then you've got to find what's your policy in that aggregation. If you care about cow health in developing countries, then you care about methane and nitrous oxide from livestock. And it's not 100%, it's 50%, because you're only talking about developing countries, or something, it's a conversation, it's a facilitation that's required. And you'll see manure management and animal health and use of feed additives. They're in the description, right? But they're not individually disaggregated policy sliders.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Cool. Now, Josh, did you want to talk about some of the new stuff before we get too far down the pike here?
Yeah. So
you've mentioned methane.
I've talked a little bit about most of them. kind of in the context of our little workshop, which is what I was hoping for. But maybe what I'll do is just talk about these here on the right, and then maybe damage function, and we can just see where questions land. So as I mentioned before, we had we had afforestation as a policy. We now have nature-based carbon dioxide removal, which includes the land used for afforestation. It also includes agricultural soil carbon. So this is practices like farming practices like no-till agriculture or organic agricultural practices. And then there's biochar, which is the conversion of biomass into a charcoal that you can then use as bury it in the soil as a way of sequestering it. Technological carbon removal used to include biochar and ag soil carbon. Now it is direct air capture, it is enhanced mineralization, and that's it. Those are the two that are now part of what we're calling technological carbon removal. A lot of debate there on where these things belong, and of course, anytime you bucket stuff that's in a Venn diagram, you could always look at it a different way. But now specifically with methane, and let's start with energy. So this is the let's do methane intensity of energy here, and we'll look at the energy. This one. Right. So we looked at this a little before when we were talking about getting to our below 2 degrees scenario. But if we think about what would change the methane emissions from energy, we can either affect its scale. How much are we engaging in the things where methane emitting activities are coming from? Or how can we adjust the intensity of those activities through things like plugging leaks? And so you can see here, this is the intensity of that being reduced, which is then this is the output of that. This is the intensity plus or multiplied by the scale. So if we reduce coal here, you can see coal scale goes down. And this is a huge improvement over the methane activities that we had before, which were, it's one slider, methane and other gases, and that was it. The other thing in waste and leakage is F gases. F gases, fluorinated gases, are an area that's actually still in improvement for us. We have, we have done some work to. You can see this is the graph of all of our greenhouse gas emissions: CO2, F gases, methane, CH4, and nitrous oxide, as well as our land use CO2. And you can see as you reduce F gases, you do get a reduction. But again, this is just a % reduction. So this is an area that we're improving now. So that's energy. There's waste. Again, we did a little bit of that with our scenario. And so you can see this ramp coming down from a more or less steady state amount of methane intensity of waste down to some new reduced level, which is, there are certain limits to how much agriculture can be reduced, how much the methane from agriculture can be reduced. There's only so much you can do with waste best practices. So things like composting, recycling, reducing consumption, using gas capture programs at landfills and wastewater treatment facilities. Even then, there's always going to be some emissions. And so there's this floor of what you can accomplish even at 100% of the potential reduction. So any questions on those? That's really the big new work that we've done.
You were also mentioning the damage function. I know that's not from this year, but from last year, I guess, right?
Yeah, so last summer, we did something that really none of the other integrated assessment models do, which is integrate and economic damages from climate change into our modeling. So every time step of our model, there is a calculation of what is the temperature, what is this value here, and how is that going to affect the economic growth of the world? And so we can go here to GDP per capita, and let me bring this back. And in our 3.3 baseline scenario, which is this black line, and it's currently the current line, you can see that there is this dashed line, and that dashed line is what would the economic growth of the world be, the global world production be, if it hadn't been for climate change. So the way we explore that is with this economic impact of climate change assumption. And this is the graph of, and it's one of the few graphs that isn't a behavior over time graph. So this is a temperature on the x-axis and a percent GDP damage on the y-axis. So in the Burke 2018 damage function that we use as our default, you can see at 3.3 degrees, you're getting about 25% of the GDP growth that you would have had is being reduced. And we can turn this off and we can see, let's go to, back to, the current scenario is now at the dashed line. You'll also notice that the temperature has gone up. So not only has the climate damaged the economy, but you can draw that connection back to economic activity, to emissions, to greenhouse concentrations, to climate change temperature increase. And so that there's this feedback loop of temperature and economic growth.
So the larger the economy, the more it grows, the more the temperature rises. And if it doesn't grow as much, then that affects the temperature in a positive way. But there are consequences to that for people, presumably.
Yeah, and one of the big differences that we noticed in our analytical work using the model was we would do something like a carbon price, and we would see, okay, why is the temperature changing maybe not as much as we thought it should have? And we realized, or as we were building this model, that the growth of the economy is increasing. The carbon price is lowering temperature, right, through lowering energy demand for fossil fuels, which is increasing the economy, which is increasing the demand for energy consumption, some of which is consumed with fossil fuels. And so there's this compensating feedback loop that makes the analysis of En-ROADS much more interesting and sometimes a little more complicated. But it has been something that very few other integrated assessment models do, except maybe as an afterthought. They'll apply some percent reduction after their scenarios run, as opposed to integrated into each time step.
Yeah, and I guess, I mean, it must be very, very difficult to make any kind of real judgment about how much temperature change is going to affect economic activity and vice versa, which is why over on the left-hand side there, you've basically got five research, well, or four researchers or publications that you're basically using their conclusions, right? And there's quite a bit of variation among those four.
Yeah, that's right. And you can see, Burke 2015, same lead author, quite a bit of a significant difference in terms of what happens throughout the end of the century. There's also the possibility to create your own scenario. And so this is also there for users who, want to experiment with different formulations and may have a different opinion of what the climate might do in terms of economic damages.
Great.
So
Does
maybe
anybody
with
have
that,
any?
I'll
Oh,
I'll
go
just
ahead, Josh.
go to questions from here. Yes.
Well, I just representing people who I know can't be here today. Two big questions: nuclear, which I know could be big nuclear or modular nuclear, and plastics. Can you speak to either of those?
Yes, certainly. So by plastics, do you mean recycling and the reduction of plastic waste?
How about just going for no single-use plastic? That's less complicated, if you can.
Yeah, so that would be one of those more disaggregated policies that we would say comes here in the form of methane and nitrous oxide from waste. So when we look at landfill waste, which is predominantly where plastics end up, oceans is also another area where plastics do end up. That has a tremendous impact on environmental variables, but not that, like, it would double count here as an emission for climate outcomes. So there's this distinction between, is that a climate policy or a very important environmental policy. But things like reducing consumption, so reducing those single-use plastics, reducing plastics in total, recycling them, or more end of life, like composting. Plastics wouldn't be included in that, but gas capture potentially. And so this variable here, percent of best practices for reducing methane and nitrous oxide from waste, is how you would represent reuse or reduction in plastic use. And I'm sorry,
How
what was the
about?
other one? Nuclear.
Oh,
Yeah.
before you go to there, though, I was just wondering about what about production of plastics? I mean, that's where a lot of methane and other stuff comes from. How do you fit that in, or where do you fit it in?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because that, a lot of plastics are feedstock from oil or bioenergy. It's a perhaps an even larger step beyond, but I would say that's a reduction in buildings and industry, a lowering of an increase in efficiency for buildings and industry, right? If you're making things more efficiently in an industrial setting like plastics, this is the variable that you would use. And then the other question was nuclear, and we do have nuclear, and this slider does represent both the larger nuclear, any existing nuclear technology is really what this slider represents. So you could subsidize it, and you can see this blue wedge increasing throughout the end of the century, or you can tax it, and you can see that it shrinks. There's also new zero carbon, which is our in the same sense of being able to capture all kinds of new technology. It represents the new types of small modular reactors, or fusion technology, or advanced geothermal technologies. And we can see, as we have a breakthrough in new zero carbon, this new orange wedge of primary energy comes into play. And there's a number of policies. How long does it take to commercialize? What's its initial cost relative to? There's a lot of interesting analysis that we've done on the role that fusion and electrification of buildings and industry and transportation could have. Some complementarity there. Similar to renewables, it's also, if we look at subsidizing renewables and a breakthrough in new zero carbon, a lot of what we see is the crowding out of those two with each other. Maybe the best way to look at it is with the final energy, which is this graph. You have a lot of renewables already, when you add new zero carbon, you do reduce coal and natural gas and regular conventional nuclear, but you really are taking the biggest bite out of existing zero carbon energy, renewable energy. And then there's maybe yet another layer there of what role does hydrogen play in facilitating that? Hydrogen or other energy storage can enhance the deployment of renewables, and kind of fusion might get a smaller share. But if you think fusion is more likely than hydrogen as a form of energy storage, then maybe this is the graph that you would look to.
Mhm.
Lois had a question about the effect of COVID. Lois, do you want to
Yes.
unmute?
Hi, thank you for taking my question. And just this is speculation, but that kind of abrupt small time descent that happened in the numbers that was clearly COVID related
Yep.
showed something that couldn't be sustained at that pace or that trajectory. But did you ever model out how that trajectory itself at a more manageable pace that wouldn't crash the world's people and economy and environmental goals could be managed? What could be done to have maintained that instead of going right back to what we do best, which is heat the planet? Yeah. So just wondered. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. And we actually just removed a couple of releases ago. We had controls for COVID variables, and we decided that we were a long way. Some of the variables were like, how long do we think COVID will continue to persist as a major economic force? And a lot of the data shows we're past that. Now, one of the things that, because we did that modeling, we asked the very similar question that what you just asked, which was, could we or should we introduce something like novel disruptors to the economy, as part of our analysis? And that is something that we still continue to think about. And we could also leverage that modeling to understand just how sheer reductions in demand, which is really what COVID was. It was just a massive top-down reduction in economic demand, which of course reduced the demand for fossil fuels. How that might be implemented in a different way. And there's a lot of discussion around the orderly phase out of fossil fuels, the orderly reduction in demand for the production of fossil fuels. So that is also something that we're considering for future improvements. Thank you. That's a great question.
Great. Well, Josh, I think now maybe we can go to John. Has a short presentation of a few minutes. Maybe you can hang out and contribute to it. And we need to leave a little bit of time at the very end for our colleague Susan to talk about what's coming up next. So, John, do you want to go ahead?
Great, thank you. I will share my screen.
So this is basically what people can do in response to some of the things that we've heard about tonight.
Yeah. So I've never said this with the director of climate modeling looking over my shoulder, but I've been telling people that a strong carbon price, such as we could get with a carbon fee and dividend in the US, pushing that price around the world with a carbon border adjustment mechanism, gets us halfway to our 1.5 degrees target. So if you start at 3.3 degrees, and then you add about $9 per ton of CO2 from now through the rest of this century, That's the minimum price that the IPCC has for its 1.5 degree target. Then we're halfway there. So we can hear what Josh has to say about that. But this shows how powerful carbon pricing is. And the other power that carbon pricing gives us is it makes it much more feasible to do a lot of the other policies, because when pollution has a price, everybody, businesses, investors, consumers, towns, wants to reduce their pollution costs. And so we get everybody aligned in advocating for more policies to reduce pollution, which makes things like increasing building and transportation efficiency much easier to do, and even permitting reform. Okay.
And there might even be some innovations that come out of that too, because people start researching and trying new things.
Exactly. So is carbon pricing necessary? Well, according to the experts, it is if we want to meet our climate goals. Janet Yellen, our Treasury Secretary, said in her confirmation hearing, we cannot solve the climate crisis without effective carbon pricing. And the IPCC, in its special report on 1.5 degrees of warming, stated explicit carbon prices remain a necessary condition of ambitious climate policies. I think an economist wrote that. They basically say we have to price carbon to meet the 2 degree, or especially the 1.5 degree target. And in their third volume on mitigation and adaptation of the 6th assessment report, the IPCC mentions carbon pricing over 500 times. Senator Whitehouse in Congress produced this graph from a Hamilton Project report, which shows of the 1,000 policies they looked at that the US government could do, what is viable and could help us try to meet our 50% emissions reduction target by 2030. Carbon fee was by far the most powerful. The next most powerful was carbon fee, but with some repeal of some of the IRA. I don't know how you get both of those things at the same time, but expanding the IRA.
Negotiation.
Yeah. I think it depends on how the elections turns out, whether some of the IRA would be repealed, and it would be interesting to see if something else could replace those policies. But expanding the IRA is not all that powerful. We picked the low-hanging fruit with subsidies already. So while we do get some benefit from more carrots, we don't get nearly the benefit of adding some sticks, a price signal on pollution into the economy. And then the yellow line is the worst case scenario. The IRA is repealed and no other policies are added, and we really fall far behind. So carbon pricing is necessary, but not done well, it could be regressive. However, there's solutions in policy to address that. In the AR6, again, the IPCC wrote, carbon pricing is the most effective if revenues are returned to taxpayers corresponding to widely accepted notions of fairness. And in a recent study on the carbon fee and dividend bill in Congress, Noah Kaufman and others found in a Columbia University report, use of revenues for equal carbon dividends creates a highly progressive policy. On average, low and middle income households receive more in rebates than they pay out of in increased prices of carbon emitting services and products. And another study finds that 2/3 of all American households would come out ahead if we charged the fossil fuel industry a pollution fee on production of fossil fuels and rebate all the money in equal shares to all Americans. And that policy is also recommended by the largest group of economists ever about any policy, including 4 former chairs of the Federal Reserve, 28 Nobel laureates, and 15 former chairs of the Council of Economic Advisors. It's called The Economist Statement on Carbon Dividends. I highly recommend you read this, but not tonight. I've summarized it for you. The first 2 are basically put a steadily rising carbon fee on fossil fuel production, rebate the money collected to households in equal per capita shares, use a carbon border adjustment mechanism or carbon tariff in trade with free polluting countries to protect US businesses and incentivize other countries to also to also price carbon. And this is the most efficient approach. Gregory Mankiw is one of those economists on that statement, a professor at Harvard. He was on George Bush's, he was the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, said, "The closest thing I know to a panacea in the climate change debate is putting a price on carbon and rebating the revenue to citizens." But is it possible? Because there are enormous headwinds to putting a price on carbon, mainly from the fossil fuel industry and some free market fundamentalist ideologues, because they understand this is how we shift off of fossil fuels and onto a clean energy economy. However, Greta Thunberg, one of my climate heroes, said, "Until you start focusing on what needs to be done rather than what is politically possible, there is no hope. We need to keep the fossil fuels in the ground, and we need to focus on equity." And of course, carbon fee and dividend, according to that economist statement, is the most cost-effective and equitable approach to do that. I like to tell people carbon pricing is inevitable, but when and how we do it matters. 73 countries and regions are pricing carbon now, averaging to $5 per ton of CO2 across all fossil fuels. But for those countries that are pricing carbon, it's higher. 23% of the countries have, of the economy has a price on carbon. So that averages out to about $20 per ton of CO2. Our trading partners are increasing their prices. The EU is at $80 per ton of CO2 now. Canada is using carbon fee and dividend at about $60 per ton now, and they'll be at $135 per ton in 2030. So we need this policy, but there's a political feasibility problem. That's all it is, and that's where we come in, each of us. Gregory Mankiw said, if we want to change the president's view of carbon taxes, then we need to change the public's view of carbon taxes. Once the American people are convinced, the politicians will fall in line very quickly. Of course, Congress also. And the reason why 40 instead of 400 members of Congress are going to En-ROADS demo is because their voters and the public are not telling them this is a top level issue. So how do we create the political will for carbon fee and dividend? Well, you can learn the simple message: it shouldn't be free to pollute, and give the money back. This is the message Kath McKenna came up with in Canada to help Premier Trudeau get carbon fee and dividend legislated as the backstop measure in Canada, a national carbon price. That's a great podcast, by the way.
Let me do this because I kind of have to focus on
talk about
this
carbon fee and dividend whenever climate change is discussed. So let's talk about solutions, and specifically a fully rebated carbon fee on fossil fuel production to get people aware that this policy exists. And think of who you know that can help, and talk with them and encourage them to talk about it, influencers, to help spread the word about carbon fee and dividend. What you can do right now is write Congress. Citizens Climate Lobby I'm the New Hampshire state coordinator. It's a volunteer position, but it's 200,000 people across America, 1,900 members in New Hampshire, working to create the political will for a livable world, starting with the most impactful and equitable climate policies. You can help us when we join Congress in June at our conference. We're going to be showing them the graph that I showed you in the beginning about the policies that can let the US come close to meeting its 50% emissions reduction goal. And we're going to be asking them again to legislate carbon fee and dividend a bill. So this webpage, cclusa.org/price-carbon, will ask for your contact information and then create a message for you asking for that. You can add a sentence or two about your concern about climate change and then send it to your members of Congress. You can also join CCL from the form. It's an opt-in to get on the newsletter. there's a couple other things in New Hampshire that we're doing and are helping spread across the country. A student-led movement called the Carbon Fee and Dividend Movement is a simple sign plastered all across campus. My daughter goes to Bowdoin, and when I picked her up yesterday, there were most effective climate policy signs all over everywhere I went. She and a team of students, it's the picture on the right and more, are helping inform students at their college about the policy and giving them a way to write Congress. They have the bit.ly link at the bottom that goes to the same page of the link that I just showed you. This started at William and Mary College last year. It's now in 18 schools across the country, and you can help spread it to your local school, high school or college. And then there's the Carbon Cashback Coalition. We've put a citizens petition warrant article in 44 town warrants over the last several years, and 3/4 of them have passed. The resolution is we ask our state and federal legislators to pass carbon fee and dividend legislation to protect our future in a way that's equitable and good for business. Okay, that's all I have. And so I'm happy to answer any questions, but thank you so much for letting me put in my, this is a feasibility problem, not a technical problem, not a policy problem. And it's up to each of us to tell our elected leaders what we want. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Awesome. Josh, any comments before we let you go?
No, that's John, I really appreciated that. And there's, of course, carbon pricing is the most powerful lever in En-ROADS, and a lot of the integrated assessment models that we compare against use the carbon price as the main input into their scenarios. And so I think you're right on with your analysis.
That's encouraging. Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks, Josh, so much. It's really awesome to hear from you and someone who's so much in the midst of all this work and really from the horse's mouth. It's great. So thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And Susan, you have your coming attractions slides.
Okay, so first of all, if you want to listen to this a few more times to be able to absorb how much information we got, go to newhampshirenetwork.org, all spelled out, and you'll see a drop down for events, and it should be there in about a day or two. We have some upcoming events. June 13th, Climate Voters Unite. We're going to have some members of other environmental groups who do engage in political action, which we don't, suggesting how you could piggyback or join them or support them financially. And also we have some ideas for nonpartisan ways that you can be a force in your town. We're hoping to really network the state with bird doggers and citizen investigators. So June 13th is when you can find out about that. And then June 26th, the aftermath of fast fashion, and that picture kind of gives you a hint of where that's headed. So again, go to newhampshirenetwork.org and you'll find the links for registering for those. They're not up quite yet, but they will be soon. We have our second annual Keep New Hampshire Green Environmental Summit that will be happening again in the North Country at the Star King Institute in Plymouth, New Hampshire. Might look a little different in the daytime, but still probably beautiful. It'll be Saturday, August 24th in the morning. And we especially want to think about how can environmental groups collaborate. Last year, there was a lot of networking and recruiting and getting to know what are all the problems we're worried about. And this year we want to think about solutions and ways we can really work together. And that will include hopefully some ideas about the election, which at that point will be quite soon. And finally, we do have working groups. John Gage has a climate working group on the second Wednesday of the month. But even before that, Rob Pinenso that we heard from has his environmental working group. Will be meeting this Wednesday at 5, and he's especially focusing on environmental justice at this meeting. And then municipal energy committees do not have a forum to get together and discuss problems, solutions, ideas. Well, we now have a municipal energy committee, and that meets the third Wednesday of the month at 3 p.m. We picked the most ridiculous time we could think of. And plastics will be having 2 meetings this summer, June 3rd, and there's another one in July at 6 p.m. And we had been meeting on legislation policy every week, but I think that the session has wound down. But we won't be quiet because we're thinking about legislation for next year. So again, New Hampshire Network is where you can always find this information, get the Zoom links, get the agendas, and that's how you find us. Thanks so much for being here. And thank you again, Josh, Reinmar, everyone.
Thank you, Josh Loughman. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Susan. And thank you, John. And we will see you all next time. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Josh. That was spectacular.
Thank you very much.